The doctrine of the Trinity is one of the most recognizable facets of Christianity, but what about the dark side? Father, Son, and Holy Ghost meet Satan, Antichrist, and false prophet, the Unholy Trinity, nearly 2,000 years in the making. To understand the Unholy Trinity, we first need to understand a simple concept with a big name: eschatology, or studies related to the end of the days.
I think something terrible is coming. The apocalypse, the end times.
In the early days of Christianity, there was a kind of evolving chaos of beliefs about good and evil and the end of all of it. Take, for example, Arianism, which holds that Jesus wasn't the equal of God the Father, but was created by him. Hence, no Holy Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Ghost as we know it. Again, it was early days, and the doctrines that seem so solid to some of us now were still just being debated and discussed. One of those debaters was Irenaeus of Lyon, who wrote Against Heresies in 180 AD, in which he claims the apocalyptic events of Revelation were engineered by an anti-God cabal driven by Satan. Hippolytus of Rome jumped on the bandwagon in On Christ and Antichrist, written in 202 AD, suggesting that the Antichrist in Revelation is a vessel of Satan. Eventually, like around 200 years later, St. Augustine writes City of God, in which he compares heaven to the city of man, which he says is ruled by Satan, who's hell-bent on establishing an earthly inversion of heavenly order, basically hell on earth, in other words. And here's where we get the Unholy Trinity. Augustine's theory causes later theologians to envision Revelation's false prophets and Antichrist as agents of Satan, making one unholy trio. In reality, it was 1,500 years after St. Augustine that the notion of the Unholy Trinity finally crystallized. In the meantime, several medieval Christian theologians dug deep into the notion of the end times, beginning with Bede the Venerable, who lived from around 672 to 735 AD. Bede was one of the first to try and interpret Revelation in a non-symbolic real-world way and the explanation of the apocalypse. In the book, he provides a blow-by-blow explanation of each chapter of Revelation, framing events in relatable, easy-to-understand terms. In chapters 6 and 8, for instance, he describes the Antichrist as a kind of chief heretic guided by Satan, who leads a physical army against the Catholic Church. Bede paved the way for later thinkers like Joachim of Fiore in the mid to late 12th century, who began to associate biblical characters with real-world individuals. For example, Joachim flat-out stated that the Muslim leader Saladin was the sixth head of Revelation's dragon.
Okay, that's problematic.
St. Thomas Aquinas piled on in the later 13th century with Summa Theologia, calling the Antichrist a member of the devil. He drew comparisons between Christ and God on one side and the Antichrist and Satan on the other. And if there are two evil figures opposite the Trinity, then parity demands a third. It wasn't until the Protestant Reformation, which lasted from 1517 to 1648, that Christian theologians began to use language that hinted at a formalized unholy trinity. But in keeping with their, shall we say, concerns at the time, they no longer described the unholy three as heretics fighting the Holy Catholic Church. Now it was the unholy Catholics versus the purity of the Protestants. German pastor Martin Luther kickstarted the Protestant Reformation when he attacked the Catholic Church's selling of indulgences to grant forgiveness from sin. In other words, back then, Catholics said you could buy your way off a bad list, and Martin Luther, who knew a cash grab when he saw it, begged to differ. In a nutshell, Luther called out the Pope, saying, "The Pope is the very Antichrist who has exalted himself above and opposed himself against Christ." Later on, Luther refined his thinking and decided the Pope was actually the beast from Revelation, and the papacy was the Antichrist, both of which were appendages of Satan. Freeze again. Taking the baton from Luther in 1536, Protestant leader John Calvin wrote Institutes of the Christian Religion, in which he presents Catholicism as a three-part evil, but defines Antichrist as more of a general worldly ideological poison running through nations rescued by Christianity like Italy, Germany, and England. Calvin's branch of Protestantism, Calvinism, took firm root in the early United States, and it was here that the work of John Nelson Darby, the true father of the Unholy Trinity idea, took off. The European Enlightenment, which lasted from 1685 to 1815, was characterized by a shift toward rational scientific inquiry, but in a weird retro twist, it also marked a renewed interest in figures from Revelation, like the Beast, the Antichrist, and the false prophet. This is due to the rise of premillennialism, the belief that the end of the millennium, Y2K in other words, would bring the apocalypse described in the New Testament. Spoiler alert, it didn't. Even Sir Isaac Newton, one of the Enlightenment's most brilliant thinkers, was obsessed with decoding facets of Revelation like the number of the beast, 666.
666. 666.
And in a callback to Martin Luther, Newton equated the Pope, the Antichrist. Again, as the religious and geopolitical environment shifted, theologians took advantage of the opportunity to paint real-world devils as, Satan. For example, 19th century Anglican clergyman John Nelson Darby wrote in Questions of Interest as to Prophecy that Napoleon Bonaparte was one facet of a larger satanic entity represented by three key figures: Satan, the Antichrist, and the false prophet, the Unholy Trinity. Darby was practically obsessed with the notion of the end times, to the point where he founded dispensationalism, a method of investigating history, things that happened in real life, based on its relationship to Revelation's apocalypse, a story filled with dragons, beasts, and evil numbers.
Some say that today's unrest is a sign that Satan's army has begun to assemble.
History professor Donald H. Atkinson of Queen's University brings this idea all the way forward to today's American evangelical movement, many of whom have been beguiled, in his words, into legitimately waiting for the rapture to whisk them right out of their shoes and off to paradise.
Welcome to heaven.
This brings us to the final piece of the Unholy Trinity puzzle, which fell into place less than 30 years ago when the Left Behind book series was first published. The series is a 16-volume fictional take on the events of Revelation, written by a couple of guys named Jerry B. Jenkins and Tim LaHaye. Satan is the big bad in Left Behind, followed by Nikolai Jedi Carpathia, the Antichrist, and Leonardo Fortunato, the false prophet, the Unholy Trinity. When asked about Left Behind, the late Jerry Falwell proclaimed, "In terms of its impact on Christianity, it's probably greater than that of any other book in modern times, outside the Bible."
Was it the rapture?
Yes. Yes, it was.
Whether or not that's true, thanks to the books, the term Unholy Trinity is now everywhere, from video games to black metal music to bad movies. Can't get much more mainstream than that.